Hey guys, I'm Aussie Expat. Welcome to the Aussie Expat 2 channel. Today I'll be testing the Klipsch 504C center channels, the Gen 1 versus Gen 2. Let's get into it. Okay, I don't have a pristine environment here. I don't normally do audio reviews, but recently I have upgraded my home theater to include two of these Monolith THX Ultra certified 13-inch subwoofers. These are just incredible. These are worth the money and more importantly worth the space. There's no replacement for displacement. Also upgraded the fronts with these 8000F Gen 2s. They're lovely, they sound excellent, and my prior system was the Pioneer Andrew Jones FS51s. You know, it's a budget system, but you know, they're proper speakers, so at least it's good. But I had a $60 center channel running with this. Now, the reason I waited to get a center channel and why it's the last thing being reviewed here was I wasn't really going to choose anything other than Klipsch. It's a boyhood dream to have a Klipsch setup, and I know audiophiles, I don't really respect Klipsch that much. But anyway, I've got the 8000 F2s, and so what would make sense is getting the center channel, the Gen 2 versus say the 504C Gen 1. And in reviews, I have seen that there are differences in construction and sound between these two. I'm not an audiophile. I like what I like, and so I'm just trying to decide between these two because there's a massive price difference between these two. The 8000Fs I was able to get on discount. They went on sale. The THX subwoofers, the Monolith subwoofers, they went on sale. The center channel's still full price. So this is $800 right now, and that's what I got it for. And the previous generation is only $420, so literally double the price, and it's hard to imagine that it's worth double. But let's see, let's try and find out. So far I've only listened to these in sort of just casual listening, like I'll just play a movie. I'm very impressed by the Gen 1, that's what I've been playing most. I installed the Gen 2 yesterday and watched a movie with it yesterday. The Gen 1 is absolutely amazing. It was just an unbelievable upgrade over my Pioneer center channel. And the main difference is on the Pioneer center channel at 3K and above, it just tapers off, right? Just the high frequencies just disappear eventually. While the Klipsch, or at least the Gen 1, I did a frequency spectrum on that, and it just stays flat throughout. Now, in listening to it, I've come to a new appreciation for center channels. I thought it was just really dialogue, and most of your sounds are really being driven by left and right. But in movies, really, a lot of high frequency sound effects have to come from the center because the action is happening on screen. So a lot of special effects and high frequency stuff is being driven through the center. So it is important to have that high frequency stuff really sorted out. There's also issues with multi-drivers and then having seat-to-seat response. I'm going to test that, but that's a very difficult one to test. And the reality is these are basically identical in terms of the distance between each driver. I don't think there's going to be a difference between the two center channels. If there's a problem with one, there's probably going to be a problem with the other. But yeah, it just makes the task of actually testing a center channel extremely difficult, because what do you test it with? I mean, you get dialogue, sound effect. It's just so fleeting, and you have to watch it with a movie because only a movie has center channel stuff. But there isn't a movie, there isn't some top 10 list of Blu-rays of like, here are the top 10 movies with the most awesome center track, you know? So it's very, very difficult. But in casual listening, on the Gen 1, the main thing I've spotted is, yes, I really enjoy the sound from it. I've grown a new appreciation for just exactly what a center channel is responsible for in terms of special effects. But I did find, I don't know if I'm being influenced by reviews, and I don't think I am, because they say the same thing about these Klipsch speakers in general, and that is, I did find the high frequency stuff starting to get a little bit much. I think it's just a little bit overcooked. And I want to see if I got that experience in Gen 2. I watched one movie with the Gen 2. I didn't hear it, as in I didn't hear anything high frequency just getting crazy in my opinion. But then again, it's only one movie and I didn't compare direct movies. So what I'm planning to do today is do a couple of frequency spectrum stuff with REW room, equalization, something. It's software that paired up with a calibrated mic. I can take a look at what the frequency spectrum looks like. The opening race from Ready Player One. There's some high frequency special effects there that are very interesting. Like there's this coin sound effect that's very high pitch. And that's the one that I want to sound good. It should be sharp, clear, and loud, but it shouldn't get to the point where it's like, I don't want to hear it. And that's kind of the thing I was half getting with the Gen 1, where the high frequency effects were so prominent that I felt like I needed to turn the overall volume down, but that's really not a well-rounded system ultimately at that point. So let's take a look. So first off, in terms of looks, the overall impression, so dimensions, the Gen 2 is like half an inch wider, maybe a full inch wider, so there's almost no difference. But they have changed the beveling. So on the Gen 2, there's beveling on top and bottom. I don't know if you can see that from the side here. There's beveling on top and bottom. So the face is actually a little bit smaller, so like the flat portion here. While on the Gen 1, the bottom is not beveled. So it presents a flatter face up front. And so the Gen 1, despite being a tiny bit smaller, does look a little bit more substantial, just a little bit. I think the overall impression is basically you get about, you can see just here, just on how much gap the drivers have. So a little bit more spacing on the drivers. And so the flat face of the speaker is a little bit bigger on the Gen 1 actually. And I like that look actually. I think the Gen 2 sort of gives the impression of being just slightly too slender. With the screen off, I like the look of this horn significantly more, although the smaller horn does make the woofers look a little bit bigger, so there's a trade-off. Ultimately, I think there's really no point to looking at how this looks because you can't really watch a movie, in my opinion, with all of the screens taken off your speakers. That's okay for like a listening experience, but for a movie, it's just too distracting. So I'm just going to put the screens back on these speakers, and they're just magnetic, there's no posts. So very easy to put on, high quality. And you can see one thing I don't like, and they've gone for a more bevel over here with a smaller bevel over here. I don't know if you can see that correctly, but the Klipsch logo is over here. And it's bigger and shinier, and it's on an angle, so it tends to reflect a bit more. And then here, it's just in the center. And there's no weird sort of thicker bevel above here versus here. Overall, I like the Gen 1 look a little bit more. It's less distracting. Gen 2, there's a little bit too much flair, to be honest. It's sort of drawing attention to itself. And if you look at the floor standings, you have logos that are centered. And then with my subwoofer, logos that are centered. And having it up here is a zonk, but not a big one, honestly. It's livable. And then once you get into a movie experience, you're talking about a dark room. You don't see that. So ultimately, not really a problem. I just slightly favor Gen 1's looks. So the Gen 2 is hooked up right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a mini DSP UMIC 1 microphone, my laptop, HDMI cables. I'm going to get that all set up just so I can hear do some frequency spectrum sweeps. So I've got the UMIC 1 precariously propped up against just a cardboard box here in the main listening position, or a main listening position. I've got two seats up front, so there's no center listening position unless you use that, but that's not what I usually do. So first thing to do is check the levels. So let's just check left channel. I normally set things up for 38 on my receiver. So this should be about 70 dB, something like that. So we're getting 68 point something, 69 point something. Okay, let's see the center. $67, $68. So this needs to come up by 1 decibel. So when I was running the Gen 1, it didn't need to come up by that 1 decibel. And that does check out on Klipsch's spec sheet, where they're saying that the Gen 1 is actually 1 dB more sensitive than the Gen 2. So I'm just going through speaker setup here. I'm just going to give the center channel 1 dB more, just to get that level. I'll run the signal pink noise again. Okay, solidly staying more consistently in 68 dB, not peaking into 69, but that's acceptable. It's close enough. All right, the next thing to do here is to actually do a signal sweep, and then that'll be the end of the test. So I'm just doing a signal sweep from 50 Hertz through to 20,000 Hertz. Now my cutover frequency is at like 120 or 150 if I recall correctly. I'm not so concerned about this ability to do bass. I've got plenty of bass, and I find that even 150 is okay in my setup because the main bass is coming from the front. I'm not really going to be able to localize that. And I do have 4 subwoofers in the room in total, so there's another one over here, another one over there. So it's really how well it integrates at those low frequencies, but it's really the high frequencies I'm really interested in today. So we'll do a longer sweep up to 512, so I've got 10.9 seconds, and hit start. Yeah, those high frequencies start to hurt, but the main thing with that is we're just trying to see, does it gel well with what I hear from like the floor standings, how close they are, as well as, you know, how much into the high frequencies is that decibels going up. So this is a comparison of the left and channel and the center frequency, so it's spectrum analysis. It's a little bit wavy, not necessarily because of actual issues, but you need a few more samples to be able to get more accurate stuff. But we can see here starting at 1K, so there's 1K here. It drops off a fair bit. I believe this is around the crossover frequency at 1500. So this is where the tweeter starts engaging. I believe on the Gen 1, the crossover is more at 1800. So we'll pay attention to that gap there. The red line behind there is actually the center. And we can see that it seems to have a little bit of a drop off at 2K. I'm not sure why, but we'll keep an eye on that. I do note at 1K, it's quite peaky. This is all in room, so you shouldn't expect this to be absolutely flat. But noticeably up here, getting into 10K and beyond, the center channel is not really tailing off at all, while the left channel is. Now, that may not be by design. As you notice, I am towing these speakers in significantly so that they're actually aiming at the opposite couch listening position. So let's do a right channel sweep because this one is actually aimed at that one there. But I am aiming them sort of crossing over. So like the crossover points like somewhere in the middle of the room, mainly because I get better imaging. You know, I get a better sense of the sound stage from the left and right positions when they're crossed over like that. Okay, so I've just added the right channel, which will be here in blue. We can see it's pretty similar, but we can still see that there's a big gap between the two frequencies here, between 6K and 9K, with the most of the gap happening at 9K. And I believe you can hear that. That is a relatively high frequency. It can be a bit shrill if there's like special effects that are rocking at that frequency. There's a gap there of about 3 or 4 dB, which is, you know, basically double the energy at that level. So that's, you know, slight concern. I wouldn't say this is really a great match ultimately. There isn't a reason to pick this speaker because it's matching the left and right that well. So just on that alone, I'm going to say that there's nothing super special about getting the Gen 2 paired in my room with the 8000Fs, but let's take a look at the Gen 1 spectrum a little later. So just going back into the Gen 1, I have to recalibrate the level, 1 dB difference between the two. So that's just confirmed. Okay, so I've done the sweep with the Gen 1, and I don't know if we can see the blue line here that well, the one sitting behind the highlighter. So the highlighter line is Gen 1 and the blue line is Gen 2. And in these high frequencies above 2K, so 2K sort of starting here, I'm not really seeing much of a difference between Gen 1 and Gen 2. Now, I do think there will be differences overall. I mean, the horn is designed differently, so off-axis listening may be different. I am off-axis here, the microphone's right there. This is listening position. This is how it is, basically. The only thing I would say that I could test to try figure out a difference between the two is see whether or not the mother-in-law seat is actually getting good sound, but honestly, it doesn't concern me too greatly. So there does seem to be a big trough here on the Gen 1. And it's just not as flat across here, although they both have this peak here, probably a room effect at 1K, and they both end up low here, but it's much steeper across here, so we're losing a lot more power across here than the Gen 2. I think at the high frequencies both are very comparable. I am a little concerned about this, about from 1200 to 1700 dip on the Gen 1. I'm wondering how much of that is like a room effect and maybe it's just positioning of the speaker. So I'm definitely going to try and retest this with just a different position of the speaker and see what happens, and different position of the mic. See if this drop here is just something that the Gen 2 is consistently better at than the Gen 1. So I've tried to remove the center, the Gen 2 from sitting on top of the Gen 1, and I still have that big drop at about the 1.5K mark. So let's try a couple other measuring positions and see what we see. So switching the microphone to the center position here, we're seeing the new highlighted graph here, and it's very comparable to the Gen 2, if not perhaps a tiny bit better. So this is really just the effect of the design being, you know, woofers going across left to right. You'll just end up across the positions in the room, you'll end up with positions where you're going to get gaps in those mid-range frequencies. That being said, I think the crossover point is here, so the early tail off has just disappeared. Also worth noting, going directly on axis instead of slightly off, we're seeing a little bit more of a boost going up into 13K and maintaining a little bit more energy at 15 to 20K. And here we are in the right seating position. We're actually seeing frequency almost exactly the same, Gen 1 versus Gen 2 at the high end, in that seating position over there, just the right-hand side seating position. That's actually where I'm more commonly. And this dip is actually less pronounced than the Gen 2, which is going down to here. And there's a peak here that the Gen 2 has that the Gen 1 does not. So in general, I think there is something going on over here between 1 and 2K for both speakers, but how prominent each one is really going to be very position dependent, you know, even where your head is left to right. So I don't think one has an advantage over the other. And in fact, for tonal match compared to the floor standings, let me throw the right speaker on. We can see that the green line here for the right speaker is significantly lower than the center channel. And I think for the left speaker, which is on a different axis to, what's the left? There we go. Left speaker is not pointed directly at that listening position. It's significantly lower at those lower frequencies. So I think in terms of tonal match, Gen 1 and Gen 2 at the high frequencies are pretty much the same. I think at the mid frequencies, what the woofers are doing, it's pretty similar, quite frankly. I think there's a gap here at 1500, and in fact, I think the Gen 1 actually has a gap that's more similar. So the Gen 1 has a gap that's more similar to the gap in the floor standings. Let me throw the right channel back on. Let's just take a look at that again. There's a right channel. Right channel also has a gap at this point here, about 1.4K. The center channel has a gap at about, for Gen 1, 1.5K, but the Gen 2 has a gap more at 2K. So in terms of tonal match, I would argue Gen 1 makes more sense. I also think that Gen 2's trough is is more pronounced. So just in general, I'm not really seeing anything here from the spectrum analysis that's telling me go Gen 2, honestly. It's definitely leaning towards Gen 1 for me, if just for the fact that the price is there. I'm not seeing any significant difference in the high frequency, and both are higher than the floor standings, so tonal match is just slightly different for the centers versus the floor standings. Really, that's my assessment there. And in terms of tonal match, I think there is a gap here, but at least the gap is closer between the center and the left and right channels if you go with the Gen 1 versus the Gen 2, which has a gap a little bit higher in the frequency here. So that's the frequency spectrum for multiple seats. That's my overall assessment, that last thing on the graph there. I just think in terms of tonal accuracy, in my room, the Gen 1 is making a little bit more sense. At the high frequency, I don't think there's a full match with the floor standings, but they were basically the same, so neither one was closer at the higher frequencies, in my opinion. Then when we got to the mid frequencies, the Gen 1 had a gap, and so the Gen 2's gap in my room was more pronounced than the Gen 1 gap, and the Gen 1s share a gap that my floor standings are. So for tonal match, I think the Gen 1 checks out a little bit better. I also like the aesthetics of the Gen 1 just a little bit better, and the Gen 1 is basically literally half the price. So I'm just not seeing much value from the Gen 2. I'm going to spare myself further listening tests because I did watch a movie on the Gen 2, Pacific Rim, you know, a big monster movie. I didn't hear anything in particularly different compared to the Gen 1. There weren't many high frequency effects in Pacific Rim. I think, as I said, I'm just not used to hearing that many high frequency special effects, as my center channel was, quite frankly, very budget before. And so my ears do have to get a little bit more used to that sort of flatter tone going across the high frequency spectrum. But the Gen 2 is not an answer for that. The Gen 2 has almost the same frequency response at the high frequencies. And that's what I heard during movies as well, is that there isn't really a difference between the Gen 1 and Gen 2 to my ears at the high frequencies. In the mid-range, I didn't pick up where those two gaps were, so tonal match type stuff is not a huge difference to me there. So ultimately, I think even for me, in my room, if you're trying to match up with the 8000 F2s, you don't have to go with the Gen 2 center. You just don't. Just doesn't seem to really hold up in my room. Now, this is all in-room experience, right? This is what matters to me. I cannot objectively make the same statement across. There's not anechoic chamber testing, right? This is just me in my room seeing what both of them check out as. And for sure, the Gen 1 and Gen 2, there isn't much difference. And the mid-frequency gap is just a little bit closer to the mid-frequency gap that I'm experiencing on the Gen 2 8000 F2s. So my opinion, if you don't have the equipment, you don't want to do this testing yourself to test between Gen 1 and Gen 2, it's going to be hard to justify buying the Gen 2 without something special happening in room. So you should test it if you have the equipment and want to and have the time and effort. Otherwise, I'd say in general, you're not going to tell the difference between the two.